So I'm Carly Richmond, and I'm here today to talk about monitoring, which I think we probably expected somewhere at an SRE conference, but maybe we didn't expect the testing side so much. So I'm going to talk about how we can utilize a common artifact for both of these things. So specifically, I'm going to talk about Playwright, which is an open source end-to-end testing and automation framework maintained by Microsoft, and how you can combine it with Elastic Synthetics. But I'll also talk about why using a common tooling is important, yet a challenging thing. And I'll also point you to alternatives as well. So if you're not using Elastic, I'll point you in the right direction of how to get started with the same practices. But firstly, let me introduce myself more formally. It'd be rude otherwise. It's my first time in Dublin as well. So yeah, why not? So I'm a principal developer advocate at Elastic. I also manage the advocate team. Before that, I used to work at Morgan Stanley. I was a front-end engineer for just over 10 years. So I built a lot of software, made a few mistakes along the way. And we will have time for questions at the end. But if you want to grab me afterwards, I'll be floating about. Or if you think of a question tomorrow morning and go, you know what, I really wish I'd asked Carly this question, the socials there are the best place to get a hold of me. So do reach out. I don't bite. I'm friendly. Scott, honestly. So firstly, I want to take you back in time. And I might show my age a bit here. So I want to take you back to the year 2011 using my trusty time machine. So 2011 was the year I got my first graduate job working as a software engineer. But it was a slightly different role to perhaps some of my friends, because I wasn't just a software engineer. I had to do everything. Maybe not hardware requests and stuff like that. You know, I did work in a bank after all. Certain things were absolutely abstracted out. But I was responsible for an application, not just building out the logic that you expect of a software engineer and testing the features, but I also had to deal with support, outage situation. I was levels 1, 2, and 3 support, which meant quite often I was sometimes dealing with an outage situation at 5 to 10 when the regulatory portal just wasn't playing ball. True story. So I had to have a very balanced approach of constantly triaging my head and thinking, right, this is probably more important to deal with this user issue than making sure that this feature is built by the end of the week. But it also meant that eventually this had to change. And what ended up happening was actually I had, level 1 and level 2 support functions started to get handed over. Oh, I have more slides. This is not a good start. Okay. We're going to keep our fingers and toes crossed here. Okay. So when we started handing over the support, one of the things that was interesting was the opportunities to learn from each other. As a new graduate, that's the kind of things you relish. I was getting to learn best practices in monitoring, even though I was a software engineer focused more on the software and the pre-production stages. And they were also learning the intricacies of this application that I've been working on and building for the past couple of years. And I think that's how the relationship should be. It shouldn't necessarily be what I found in my next role, which was probably closer to a bit of rock'em sock'em robots. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about software engineers, we're talking about support, we're talking about SRE functions. We're all in this together to try and build and maintain ecosystems for users to use. But sometimes for various different reasons, we can forget that. Now, this is not getting any easier. This is getting harder because we've not just got dev and support factions anymore. We have this blend of SRE, which is, you need to have engineering skills as well as all the incident management, triaging, all these other skills that really lend themselves to the support side. Yet we're also trying to productionize other things. If you think about data pipelines for data engineers, you think about machine learning capabilities. And sadly, if you think about AI-generated technologies and things like prompt engineering and all these other kind of tools. For me, this role fragmentation is making this idea of uniting among common tools harder because there's more opportunities for it to fragment. Now, this might be a daft question, but who's heard of the notion of shifting left? Okay, there's not everybody's hands up. So for those who haven't, shifting left is this idea of taking particular opportunities that we think of from towards the end of the kind of just before production or the later stages of software development and try and push these activities earlier. So particular things that we might want to think about there would be things such as particular types of testing, security scanning, maybe infrastructure as code, where you can define your artifacts earlier and then have equivalent pre-production and production environment configurations. This is not a new thing. This is something that within the SRE world, we're all used to doing this still. It shouldn't be a surprise. But for some reason, some of these things are still challenging. And there's a few reasons I can think of based on my prior experience. So the first of which is going to be, if you're still working in a big, large organization, traditional walls and silos still remain that can make communication harder to do. So even with the emergence of SRE, I'm still seeing the occasions where development and support departments still exist in big companies. And that therefore means that quite often that existing Conway's Law restriction around products and how our application ecosystems are structured make it more difficult to communicate. And I'm not just talking about the idea of the size of these companies, I'm also talking about the notion of distributed nature. If you're working in London as a software engineer, but you've got a support team based out in another time zone, we don't have a lot of opportunities to overlap and collaborate, and that makes things hard. But empathy is a certain thing, which I don't think we've quite got yet there, which I think is part of the Rock'em Sock'em Robots element that I saw in one of my prior roles too, sadly. Sometimes it's difficult to understand the other side. If you're on more of the kind of production management side of the fence, you might not necessarily empathize with the software engineer who's trying to get that feature finished by the end of the sprint, because you've had a whole bunch of features thrown over from the last sprint that perhaps potentially have issues or defective or have something else that's wrong with it. But then there's the opposing side as well. We don't necessarily think about these things. And if we're going to have this joined up thinking, we need to kind of understand how we can use different tools to solve problems that the other person is having, and empathy is a big part of it. Priorities are not common. So when I think about the production side of things, I regularly remember having conversations about how do we prioritize this fix over this new feature? A new feature sometimes is easier for a business to quantify because it has normally some form of cost or benefit associated with it. This quantifiable number of a benefit that's kind of flashing saying, this is going to cost us X dollars if we do this or don't do this. Meanwhile, a fix that has a known workaround but is still irritating and is requiring manual intervention on the support side of things, that often takes a lot longer to prioritize because it's less clear where it fits and what the benefit is. And that shouldn't always necessarily be the case. It just sadly means that in the state of where teams are primarily using Scrum or some form of agile framework, if you have a representative product owner or individual trying to make these decisions, they might not always understand the trade-off. We also need to talk about quality because we do take shortcuts still. I'm happy to admit it. And that means that sometimes we do plaster over things, or we just put in the minimum fix, or we put off that upgrade because we're too busy doing something else. All of these things are problematic. But all of these things can potentially be solved or can be further fragmented by a lack of common tools. The idea that it doesn't matter where in the life cycle of software you sit, quite often we're using different tools for the same thing. And this is where my argument now comes in. So firstly, show of hands. Who knows what end-to-end testing is? Okay, most of us, good. So for those who don't, interesting, there's a delay. There we go. End-to-end testing is about the user perspective. People regularly tell me, well, no, it's actually about making sure that you touch all the software layers in your application. And there's part of that, absolutely. But when you think about the frameworks that we're typically using, so Cypress, Playwright, for my Sims Protractor in my Angular days, has anyone used Protractor? No one? Come and ask me afterwards if you'd like to hear more about Protractor. I did have an interesting discussion about this earlier, actually. So it's not the software layers necessarily. The software layers are part of it. It's about the user perspective that you're automating. You're automating the clicks. You're automating the text entry. You're automating the things that a user does and validating that your software in its current state is doing that as you expect within a reasonable amount of time, especially given we think about web applications and sometimes the concurrency related issues that can come into these kinds of tests. But then we've also got synthetic monitoring. So a new show of hands, who's heard of synthetic monitoring? Less hands. I'll be honest, I was surprised about that, but that's really interesting. Good to know. So synthetic monitoring is where we're running some form of script on an automated schedule to try and validate that our application is alive and responding to input as we expect at that particular point in time. So traditionally, when I think of synthetic monitoring, I think of heartbeats. I think about these simple vanilla pings that I was sending to a Java service and a health endpoint, running on a fixed schedule to see that it was alive or not. And there's absolutely still a place for those. But many tools are now evolving to make use of automated testing tools to actually simulate that user journey again. The difference is where it's running. It's running in production. It's running against where a user actually resides and interacts with. Now, there's two ways I'm seeing that this can be done within the state of the tools that we have at the moment. So some of them are making use of recording capabilities, or you have to manually configure in the UI of the appropriate tool what the steps are that you want it to try and deal with. Now, that's fine, but it doesn't really make it easy for us to test our monitor, which we should be able to do. We should be able to say, if I run this monitor, it's going to fail for this reason, or it's going to pass for this reason. The other option is we use a codified artifact, which if your observability provider supports some form of automation tool, you can do. The problem is sometimes that can be different to the end-to-end testing framework that you're using. And I have first-hand experience of this. So one of my last roles, I was writing end-to-end tests quite happily in Cypress and it was going well. But I then had colleagues looking at more of the production management side of things that were running similar definitions using Selenium, because that's the tool that they were familiar with. But these are both automation frameworks and they're both common testing tools as well. So why do we need two tools for something that's pretty similar when we can get advantages from using a common tooling? Because if you think about it, not only can we validate these monitors ahead of time to make sure they work against that version of the software, you've got a common artifact that can deal with a lot of the communication challenges that I've seen, because you're communicating, if you build them and run it all the way through, how the application is intended to work in production. You're able to test your features against it to make sure you're not going to inadvertently break the monitors. And you can also, if you're using a common artifact for those heartbeat monitors as well, you have the whole definition of the expectations of frequency and how you're monitoring your application available in an artifact that anyone with an engineering background can understand. So I'm going to talk through an example. So that QR code there, if you want to take a look at it, will help you follow through the code, since I'm not trusting this screen anymore. But what we're going to do is we're going to walk through an example. We're going to use Playwright, which is an end-to-end testing and automation framework maintained by Microsoft and licensed under Apache 2. I checked it earlier today. I'm going to show you it running within a CI pipeline using GitHub Actions as well, but of course any CI pipeline is fine. And then I'm going to show you it embedded in Elastic Synthetics. If you're not using these tools and you take one thing away from what I'm saying today, look at what the automation tool is in your observability platform and what you're using for end-to-end testing and see if you can align. That's how you're going to get the architectural benefit of this. So if it's Selenium, that's great, that's fine. If it's Cypress, no problem. It's more about embracing the infrastructure as code mentality and being able to have an automated monitor definition. Right, so we've already kind of walked through this flow, so I'm not going to spend a lot of major time on it, but the idea is that we've got this common artifact again, okay? We've got these user journeys or monitors. I will apologize, I'm probably going to use these terms interchangeably, so when you hear journey and you hear monitor, think monitor. We can run them in CI, we can push them to run as a production monitoring step, and then we can use them actually as a validation point to identify fixes. So for example, if something does go wrong, we can test against this definition and see that we validate the fix is going to work potentially. So here's the components, the pieces, and where they fit when we think about dev and production, okay? So what I've got is a code-based repository that contains these monitors as code artifacts. These can then be run as part of local development, effectively as an end-to-end test. Now, there might be a subset. It might be you have a more expansive suite of end-to-end tests and a reduced production monitor set, because there is certainly a cost associated with running these things. It might be you want to have more fine-grained ones earlier in the cycle. But what you're wanting is for some form of artifact, and I'll show you how you can enable and disable these with conditional logic. We're then going to push the monitors to where they're going to be running against the production app in this case. And then obviously because it's Elastic, the results are in Elasticsearch. But this would be the point here if you're using another observability tool where it's still going to be pinging the production app. It's just that it's going to be using the same artifact. So this is my little toy app that we're going to instrument. So we're going to focus on this simple text entry flow of a username and password. I will briefly show you an example of a token-based authentication because every time I do this talk, I always get that question. But I'll point you in the right direction of what to do because you would be using the Playwright request object to simulate that particular token. So right, can we all see the code? Cool. Well, it's still up and running. Right. So here is a simple Playwright test because I want us to focus on the Playwright syntax first before we start talking about monitors. So what you'll see here is everything in Playwright happens with a page object. So quick show of hands, who's familiar with Playwright? Okay, there's a few, but not many. Okay, so everything happens on the page object. All of the interactions that you're wanting to simulate for a user, all of the navigations, everything is interacting with the page object. But Playwright also has an asynchronous format as well, so that's why you're seeing async and await all over the place, which is nice for an end-to-end testing framework, because I've used the ones before where you have to add timeouts everywhere because they're not necessarily working in an asynchronous fashion, which in web apps you kind of need. So the first thing we're doing is we're going to the login page, which you kind of expect the first thing a user to do. Then I'm pulling out the login form and I'm using the test ID. So this is a shorthand locator in Playwright called get by test ID. You will, if you start looking through the documentation, see locator everywhere. Now, locator allows you to specify a CSS path or expression. The problem is, if you start going down that route, you're effectively coupling the ID and characteristics associated with styling and appearance of your page to the logic that pulls out the elements of your page for testing. That makes them brittle and prone to breaking, as I found out firsthand when I started writing my first sets. Because it would mean if someone changed the style on something, or if someone changed the ID slightly, or someone even moved something to a different point in the HTML tree, you end up in a situation where your test breaks, and that wastes a lot of time if you think about it. So for productivity and sanity reasons, try and make sure you use the data-test ID attribute and add that to your HTML elements. In fact, see if you start going view page source on pages you're using day to day, you'll probably find data test ID sitting in there somewhere, which means they're probably using some form of testing framework under the hood. But back to what this flow is actually doing here. So what we do here is we're checking the submit button. So I'm pulling it out and I'm making sure it's disabled because a validation step that we still don't actually do as much, but we probably should. Don't allow people to click to log in without any credentials specified. That kind of seems obvious, but sometimes we still are able to do it. We then add in credentials, dummy test account credentials. Don't put production credentials sitting in a desk. You'd be surprised the number of times I have to say this. So these are dummy. There's no me at me.com. Please don't try and hack my toy app later. It's not going to work. And then you'll see that I'm able to fill in the attributes on the appropriate text entry fields known as an input using fill. Doing the same for the password. Then I'm checking that I actually have an enabled submit button. I click on it and make sure the navigation flow is coming through. So very simple flow. Is everyone with me? Cool. Right. I want to use a shortcut because I want to be able to generate. There we go. I want to be able to generate the configuration. So I'm going to use the init wizard, which gives me this. So it's going to give me the sample journeys, as you can see up here. It's also going to give me those heartbeat monitors, which I'm not talking about today. And then I've also got the synthetics configuration and the package.json, which will generate the commands and the dependencies like with any JavaScript project. So this is the configuration. Things I need is parameters, because think about it. I said I wanted to use the same artifact in pre-production and production scenarios. That therefore means that I need to be able to change the environment URLs and some other parameters potentially, depending on where I'm running this. So what is passed in is the node environment, so the environment that can tell us what environment conditions we're running under. And I have the URL by default set to localhost. Then what you'll see is I've got my username and password credentials coming from environment variables. which allows me to therefore pull the same things in via the CI pipeline later. And then I've also got an isLocal condition in case I wanted to hypothetically enable or disable particular monitors in a production or a CI scenario. Playwright options is, well, it kind of says what it says. It's the Playwright options. It's the additional settings and capabilities for Playwright. Now, I've got ignore HTTPS errors, but one of the most common reasons to using Playwright options is something called device emulation. So if you're, for example, supporting multiple different types of devices, basically accessing your site, you probably want to double check a few different devices to see. The number of times as a front-end engineer where I've found that, oh, someone's using this different size thing, this different size screen, and I've ended up in the situation where I can't actually click on that button because it's hidden. We need to think about these particular things. So sometimes emulating several different devices, which Playwright allows you to do, is an important thing. I've then got the monitor settings. So by default, unless you specify otherwise, these are going to run every 10 minutes. And then I've got my project settings. So where's the Elastic Stack I'm sending these to? And then you'll see I'm overriding the URL for the production situation. So I'm going to be pinging a different instance of my app depending on where I'm running it. Is everyone with me? Cool. I'm not going to expect you to read this. It might be a bit small. But what I do have is how I've changed the test. So what you tend to find with these monitors is they're multi-step, which makes sense because you wouldn't want to run the full test and have it fail. It doesn't really help you understand where in the particular user flow it's broken. And these user flows can sometimes, depending on the application you're working on, like financial applications, for example, they can be quite expansive. So being able to split it into steps to see which particular one failed is useful, but it also lends itself to patterns such as behavior-driven development. So has anyone used BDD before? There's a few of us. So for those who haven't, it's normally where you might have used tools like Cucumber or something before, but it's this idea of specifying behavioral syntax in an English-like language to basically say what your application should be doing. So it's another way of defining a user-focused test if you think about it. So what I've got here is on the first step, I'm going to the URL. So I'm pulling in the URL as a parameter, okay? But then the only thing aside from splitting us into steps that's changed is nothing. I'm still using Playwright page object underneath, pulling out things by test ID, not by CSS classes, and everything else that was there before. None of that's changed there. Okay, so this is the authentication example. So what you'll see is, in addition, I've passed in the request object. So the request object in Playwright actually allows us to be able to make particular API calls, which can be useful for simulating particular events. So if we think about an OAuth 2 flow, for example, where we're going off to get a token, there we go, going off to get a token that we should then use to authenticate, you would want to try and simulate that in some way. So in my example up here, you'll see that I've actually disabled this for a non-production scenario. It just seemed to make sense to show off the example of whether you can enable or disable it, because I do get the idea that you might not want to run every production monitor as an end-to-end test, and likewise. So if you want to be more selective, you can absolutely do that with conditional logic. And then what we've got is our individual steps. So what I've got in here is, firstly, I'm getting a token from the authentication service using request.get. So it's sending off to get a particular dummy value back. And then in my second step here, I'm adding that as a header to the appropriate call so I can basically validate the authentication flow. Does that make sense? I see nods. Nods are good. Cool. So we can run these locally. It's effectively an end-to-end test at this point if we really think about it. And then I can also run them within a CI pipeline. So within the CI pipeline, this is in GitHub Actions. You'll see that I've got the node environment being development, my username and password I've got coming from secrets here, but it wouldn't be the biggest thing in the world because, again, I'd be using test accounts and it's not so bad. And then I'm also outputting the results of these tests. So when I run the suite, I'm specifying the JUnit reporter so I can actually see what the results are. Like you would with any type of test, unit end to end, it doesn't matter. You should still be able to see the state of the suite and which individual test is successful or failing. It doesn't matter if it's a monitor or a test at this point. But the other thing you need to watch out for is we need to make sure that our monitor definitions are in the exact same kind of sync as our production deployment. If you end up with these out of sync, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to end up with a bunch of failing monitors and start to have a panic attack because you wonder why everything is imploding. We don't need that additional fatigue here. There's enough legitimate alerts in this world without having to inadvertently scare people with failing monitors for no good reason. So when it comes to deployment, make sure that you actually push the monitor definitions to where they're going to be running. You need to specify the node environment's production because we need to make sure that correct parameter is flowing through. And then you've also got the need to specify the username and password, and you need to authenticate with an API key. Now, you all seem lovely, but I'm using a secret vault here because I'm not giving you my key. I'm sorry. You're all lovely, but we shouldn't be putting public keys inside public GitHub repos. That's not smart. And again, it's something I have to say more often than I would like to say. I really should. So once we push the monitors, you're going to end up with something that looks like this, okay? So this is Elastic, but remember, if we're using another tool, so if we're using New Relic and Selenium, if we're using Checkly and Playwright, whatever it is, they're going to give you a similar view. They're going to show you which of your monitors are successful and failing. So you can see the one I've got that's red in the far corner here is clearly failing. But it's also going to give me useful diagnostic and metrics so I can see what's going on in my ecosystem. So this is going to show me how long the monitors are taking to run, which might be an indication of a particular step taking longer due to a delay in a downstream service, because it will still be pinging the production services here. Now, hopefully it's not going to be doing smart, really complex things that it shouldn't, so probably not wanting it to make payments. But for example, if you're utilizing Stripe or some other payment utility, they quite often have test card capabilities. So you could run this monitor with a test card configured, and that means you're not going to, run up a huge bill on someone's credit card. So moving on, we need to also be able to see which step is taking longer. And this was one of the biggest bugbears I had when I was dealing with end-to-end tests personally, was as the suite started to get longer, I was trying to figure out which particular test was taking longer. And it takes a lot of investigation. So where tools give you the duration by step, that's quite useful because I can see how long each individual step is taking. I can see failures because obviously that's the point here. I want to be able to see when that workflow is not working for a user so I can try and basically beat the support call. That's kind of the point. I want to beat the escalation here. But I can also get other associated metrics. So for me as a front-end engineer, core web vitals are pretty important to me. They give me an indication of the user experience. It's not absolutely infallible, but it gives me a rough idea. So I'm able to see not just my wait times, but also least contentful pain and my other core web vitals sitting down here at the bottom. Now, obviously, you're going to want to alert on these monitors, but with synthetic monitoring, you need to be careful. We talked about the fact that these particular monitors are asynchronous by definition of web applications. That therefore means that you probably shouldn't be sending an alert every single time one of these things is falling over. My general guidance is you need to think about the tolerance thresholds here, okay? So we need to make sure that it's not just pinging every time, but that perhaps, it's a number of consecutive failures, or it's a number of consecutive failures within a window. So in that instance, look at the particular provider you're using and look at these alerts to make sure that it's not adding a ton of noise. Because again, alert fatigue is real, people, and you don't want these monitors adding to it. So I'm not saying it's going to find everything. As I found out in the past 13 years, user app in ways that we couldn't even dream of. And one of the fundamental, sadly, limitations with any form of automated testing like this is that you're going to automate what you think a user is going to do, not necessarily what they're actually going to do. So they're still going to raise issues from time to time, I guarantee it. Or they're going to end up using a browser that you don't expect and it reacts weird with the CSS classes and you get wacky errors. Sadly, sometimes that might include Internet Explorer, even to this day. But you kind of get my point here. The idea is that we can try and preempt, and if we can't preempt, we can go back and create a definition to recreate their issue. So one of my great friends, Joe Collins, always talks about the idea of he tries to recreate a user issue with a test first. And I don't think enough of us are doing that. Is anyone doing that? Yeah, there's not many people with their hands in the room, and I'm going to put my hand down because I'm definitely not doing that. I didn't do it when I was an engineer, sadly, often enough, despite Joe's advice, and I'm still not doing it now. But what we can actually do instead is try and go back to the beginning and use this definition that recreates their activity to try and identify the fix, test the fix, and then go back the way through the pipeline again. So this is about coming together. This is about trying to identify an opportunity where we're using slightly different tools to achieve the same end. So I've talked about end-to-end testing and synthetic monitoring and how actually you should use a common automation tool. Obviously, I've used Elastic and Playwright today. If you're using an automation tool and you've got an observability provider, just start there. You know, if it's something using Selenium, start trying to run the Selenium monitors earlier in the pipeline. Embrace monitoring as code, irrespective of what the tool is. And in that particular way, that means that hopefully you've got a monitor that you can validate earlier. You've got software that you can check that whether it's going to actually break the monitoring or not. And you can potentially stop throwing broken features over into the production ecospace. And we can use these definitions as a common artifact that can be understood by anyone with an engineering background. So if you want to learn more, I've got some resources. The QR code has all of them, so don't panic if you don't get a picture of this. But there is the code sample, there is a blog on the subject, there's an advent calendar entry that covers the token-based authentication with that request parameter in Playwright. And then if anyone's using Semaphore, there's the Semaphore piece as well. But with that, Dublin, it has been an absolute pleasure. We've got time for questions, but thank you very much.